True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
On the morning of December 30th, 1978, the bodies of 45-year-old Nancy Spangler and her two teenage children were found in their home in Littleton, Colorado. All three had been shot to death with a handgun. The children were found in their bedrooms, and Nancy was slumped in a chair down in the basement with a bullet wound visible on her forehead. A typewritten suicide note was found nearby, and it was signed with an N, Nancy's initial. Join us at the quiet end for A Very Bad Husband, Robert Spangler. Nancy's husband admitted to police that he and his wife had marital problems, that he did plan to leave her, and that he was having an affair with another woman. The implication was that Nancy was so distraught over her failing marriage that she took her and her children's lives. But many people close to Nancy just couldn't believe that she could kill her beloved children. They wondered if Robert could have killed his entire family, setting the scene to make it look like a murder-suicide. This began to seem even more likely after his second and third wives also died suddenly, with Robert beside them.
Wow. So you look at hindsight and you say 3 wives, 3 deaths.
Yeah, plus 2 children, which is even more tragic.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, his own children. So why don't you give us a beer review? Because this is going to be pretty lengthy conversation, but fascinating for sure.
Yeah, this is a Mexican hot chocolate milk stout from Left Hand Brewing Company. Pretty nice beer. It's got a nice aroma, chocolate, little vanilla, hint of spice on the aroma. But on taste, you got the chocolate and vanilla. And you get a nice little bit of heat from the chili. It was a little thin, feeling it in my mouth. I expected a little more body, but that's a minor quibble. It's pretty good beer.
Yeah, it sounds great. How about you open one up?
All right, grab us one here, or 2.
Settle in here by the fire. It's that chilly time of year.
That's winter. That's what it's called.
Oh, okay. I didn't think we'd have that much of it down here, but we actually do have quite a winter. Not a lot of snow, but it's cold enough for certain.
Yeah, and it warms up.
Yep. All right. Let's talk about Robert Spangler, who really just kind of a piece of shit, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So, Robert Marilyn Spangler, who went by the name of Bob, was born in Des Moines, Iowa in January 1933. There are no records still available to say who his biological parents were. He was adopted at a very young age by Merlin and Ione Spangler of Ames, Iowa. He probably could not have been adopted by a more financially stable or emotionally involved family, but just the fact that he was adopted would always bother him, at least to some extent.
So Ames, Iowa is located right in the middle of the state, and it's surrounded by farmland. But Ames held itself apart from the farms that surrounded it because it's a university town, with Iowa State University at its center. So more than just a place, Iowa State dominates the city, both culturally and economically. One way or another, almost everyone in town has some connection to the university. And this was true for Bob's family, because his adoptive father, Merlin, was a well-respected professor at Iowa State in his field of soil engineering. For most of his early years, Bob lived in the shadow of his father. Bob was in awe of Merlin's accomplishments and may have even been envious of him as well, which would be understandable. Merlin Spangler had risen quite a bit from his humble beginnings in Iowa. He was born in Des Moines, Iowa, and he had the hardworking ethic of Midwest America at the turn of the 20th century. He studied hard and earned his degree at Iowa State University in civil engineering way back in 1919. Following that, he served 1.5 years in the United States Army during World War I. While in the Army, he was a lieutenant of field artillery. and during the war he married his sweetheart, Ione Amsbury. So from 1919 to 1924, he served as a bridge designer with the Iowa State Highway Commission, but higher learning was really his passion. So Merlin did take the time to earn his Master of Science degree in 1928. And not really satisfied with just working in education, he took an important job as a researcher of soil pressure on underground conduits as well. So just generally a very well-respected guy.
He seems to be, or have been.
Yes. His dual role of educator and researcher became the focus of his life. Of his teaching abilities, a colleague wrote later, Professor Spangler's many years of teaching on the Iowa State faculty, his expertise, and his humble and pleasant manner have carried a position of respect, admiration, and endearment for many students and alumni. His textbook also has won him many friends and is widely regarded as the best organized and most simply written for the beginning student. So I'm mentioning all this just so you know what Bob had to live up to.
Yeah, it might be a daunting task.
It was a big shadow.
So in 1941, during World War II, Merlin became an officer in the Navy. The Navy immediately saw his expertise in engineering and wanted him in their wartime construction units. Merlin did such a good job during his stint in the Navy that he ended the war with the rank of lieutenant commander. And after the war, he went on with his teaching and research career at Iowa State. And he was very successful at this. So much so, in fact, that he joined the rare group of people who have a scientific theory named after themselves. And in this case, it was the Nancy Spangler theory. So he had to share this with some guy.
With Marston, yeah. But still,
yeah,
that's a thing. That's a big thing. So Bob did have an adopted brother, Wayne, who wasn't a blood relation and never had the same issues in his early years that Bob would have. So this brings up the debate of nature versus nurture. There may have been something in Bob's genes or a psychological makeup that made him different. But whatever the reason, Bob had some bad times in his school years in Ames. One schoolmate remembered years later that Bob would get into a lot of fights in grade school. One time, the schoolmate said, Bob got into a fight with another boy and just beat the living hell out of him. He actually had to be pulled off of this kid or he would just keep beating him. And he seemed to take pleasure in hurting people. That same person was asked years later by the FBI if young Bob Spangler liked to torture animals or set fires. Now the man said he couldn't remember that, but he could remember Bob's anger when he was in a fight, and he said once he got going, he wouldn't stop. An even more serious and disturbing thing happened while Bob was a child. Another schoolboy, whom Bob hated, mysteriously drowned at a sewer treatment plant near Ames. Bob was actually considered enough of a suspect to be taken down to the police department for questioning. All documents relating to this incident have since disappeared, but it was widely known by those around him that he did have a very violent temper. But Bob was more than just a violent bully. He was also intelligent, he was athletic, and he had a lot of confidence. In fact, by the time he was in high school, he was able to focus his aggressions into sports and other activities. He joined the band, the journalism club, the film operators club, the tennis team, the track team, and the basketball team. He was a member of the varsity club, which made him part of a select group of boys at Ames High School.
And though Bob was good at all sports, and just one of these natural athletes, he really excelled in football. The Ames High School football team made the record books in his senior year. For Bob, that winning season was one of the highlights of his life, and rooting him on from the sidelines all season long was his pretty brown-eyed girlfriend, Nancy Stallman.
Yeah, Nancy was also born in Ames, Iowa. Her dad worked for the Standard Oil Company and eventually bought his own gas station. When Nancy was little, her father divorced her mother and remarried a woman named Jo Fitch. Then Nancy got a stepbrother, David, and a stepsister, Kathy. Apparently, she got along well with both because they had nothing but good things to say about her later. But Nancy got along with just about everybody. She grew up in a house that wasn't quite as well off as the Spanglers, but it was middle class and it was comfortable enough.
So they didn't lack for anything?
Not really. Not the basics anyway. They did okay.
Right.
Nancy was very active and popular in high school, too. She was in the Girls' Athletic Association, the Pep Club, the Glee Club, the Photo Club, and the yearbook and school newspaper staff. She also served sometimes as the homeroom secretary, But Nancy's favorite activities were those that brought her closer to Bob Spangler, and that was in the Film Operators Club and Cubs Club. So this was an organization open to all students who were interested in journalism. Despite Bob's interest in athletics, he was really fascinated with journalism, and he had a knack for writing and a way with words. So after high school, he planned to make journalism his major at college. Bob became a features editor on the school paper, a position that allowed him to highlight his own achievements on the football field. And Bob was always one of his best promoters. He was not modest, in other words.
No, he liked to let people know also how good he was.
Absolutely.
So Nancy was well liked in all her clubs, and she had a boyfriend who was the football star. They had dated since junior high and had no plans to stop dating after Bob went off to college. Bob was an intelligent, outgoing, funny, and energetic teenager. His occasional angry outbursts were written off just as the moodiness of a teenager. Nancy was too much in love with Bob to see the flaws in his character, but her cousin Martha would say years later that the only person Bob was in love with was himself.
Yeah, now Nancy and Bob both attended Iowa State after high school, and she was still very much in love with Bob, although now, of course, he was no longer a football star. He was just a regular old student. She worked on the journalism staff and was a member of the university's yearbook staff. When Bob graduated from Iowa State University, he had a degree in technical journalism and just disappeared from campus. He didn't bother to have his photo taken for the yearbook or attend graduation or anything. And of course, Nancy and Bob were married after college. But they had a short honeymoon period. By September of that year, Bob was in the Army as a second lieutenant. During basic training, Bob qualified with a rifle and carbine on the firing range in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. He was so proficient with the carbine that he earned sharpshooter status with that weapon. So Bob knew his way around guns and was not afraid to use them. Putting his college degree to use in the Army, he entered the Signal Corps in the Motion Picture and Television Division, and he received 9 weeks of Signal Corps training in the Army's use of communications. Bob and Nancy could not have asked for a more glamorous Army posting after he completed basic training. He became a motion picture camera officer at the Army base, and that was not far outside of New York City. He was well qualified for this, and the city must have been really exciting for this young couple from Iowa. Bob's time in the Army seemed to have gone by without a hitch, and there were no negative reports on his record at all.
A good soldier.
Seemed to be.
So he was discharged from the Army at Fort Hamilton, New York, and a whole new civilian life opened up for Bob and Nancy. He worked for a while on television in New York City, but when a better job offer came along in Minneapolis, Minnesota, he took it. Their son David was born there, but before long, Bob moved the family back to the East Coast in the New York area for another job in broadcasting. Their daughter Susan was born there. One thing noted by Martha, who was Nancy's cousin, was that wherever Bob wanted to go, that's where the family went. She said that Nancy's aspirations and career always took a back seat to Bob's. She willingly put her career aspirations on hold and developed a passion for gourmet cooking, motherhood, and taking care of her husband.
Not unusual for that time. People got married young, and a lot of women stayed home after college. So after traveling to Denver on business, Bob really fell in love with Colorado. He moved the family to Littleton, and his new job in public relations with the American Water Works Association was based in nearby Denver. So this really should have been an ideal life for the Spanglers at their home on South Franklin Way. Bob had a doting wife, 2 healthy children, and a nice suburban lifestyle. But Bob was restless, and he always wanted something more, never satisfied. So one day in 1976, the something more that Bob wanted came to him as a young, outgoing, and attractive temporary secretary named Sharon Cooper. Bob's co-workers would remember Sharon very well and the effect that she had on Bob. The two began an affair, and soon just about everybody knew about it.
Yeah, they weren't too secretive about it.
No, they really weren't. And Sharon, she was very chatty, so not a big secret keeper. She was definitely more outgoing than Bob. She was bubbly, but also quite neurotic. She had a lot of new age ideas, and she openly talked about her breast augmentation with everyone in the office. So she was kind of a trip.
Sounds like rough sledding.
Yeah, but I think Bob found her exciting.
Oh, sure.
So it wasn't very long, as you can imagine, before Nancy found out about this affair. There must have been arguments and accusations. Bob moved out of the house and into Sharon Cooper's place on Pearl Street in Denver. David and Susan were in their teens by this time, and they didn't talk much about their dad. Understandably, they didn't want to talk about the father who deserted them. Years later, Bob would tell a friend that during that year he was away, he wasn't in touch with his children on a regular basis. He only had activities with them once or twice the entire time. Nancy had lost control of the kids then, according to Bob. The general impression of Bob that year was that he didn't like his family very much, really. Even though he admitted that David was a good musician, he didn't like that David smoked marijuana, and he didn't approve of his friends. He also didn't like Susan's friends, so it was like he barely knew his children at all. It was much more fun for Bob to go hiking with Sharon up in the nearby mountains. She was energetic and funny, and she really made him feel alive. She also brought out his athletic abilities again, something he'd always been proud of. One thing he knew for sure was that Sharon didn't want any kids in her house, especially teens. Still, Sharon and Bob had their ups and downs, and Sharon definitely had more of a temper than Nancy. In fact, Sharon was prone to very dramatic mood swings. But Bob just found this very exciting, at least in the beginning. So things were really a mess for Bob in the fall of 1978. He felt like he couldn't live with Sharon, and he couldn't live without her. So perhaps looking for some peace, he moved back in with his family in October of 1978. And he may have even made an effort to save the marriage. But right after Christmas 1978, Nancy sent her father and stepmother a Christmas letter. And this said that she and Bob were happy together after their 9-month separation. She wrote about their motorcycle trips and plans for hiking excursions in the mountains. She also wrote that she'd earned a higher degree in education at one of the nearby universities, and she was really looking forward to becoming a full-time public relations person now that the kids were almost grown. So this was a very upbeat, optimistic letter, and it wasn't what you would expect of someone who was considering killing her children and herself. On the morning of December 30th, 1978, Bob would shoot Nancy, Susan, and David with complete emotional detachment. So for him, this seemed like no more than any other unpleasant tasks that he had to perform. Meeting with unsatisfied client, making cold calls, killing his family, they just all seemed to have equal weight for Bob. It was not exceptional in his mind. So after 23 years of marriage, Bob was restless. He felt like he was trapped in a boring middle-class life. His 17-year-old son David had long hair and played in a loud rock band that often practiced in the basement of their home. His 15-year-old daughter Susan had many boyfriends, none of whom Bob cared for very much at all. And even though Nancy did still dote on him, life seemed very stale to Bob. Missing from his life was something or someone exciting.
For Nancy, that Christmas with Bob had been so good that she was sure she'd heard the last of Sharon Cooper. Bob, however, had an entirely different opinion about his family life. The reconciliation seemed to be working out for Nancy, but it was not working out for him. He was tired of the disruption that his teenage children brought to the house. Both David and Susan did not respect a father who had deserted them for close to a year. Tough situation, though.
For the kids?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It really kind of threw things off for them, which, that happens when any marriage breaks up with children involved. But, Bob seemed different, like he totally ignored them, almost like he was divorcing them as well as their mother.
Yeah, and I can't fault them for throwing some blame on him.
Absolutely not. No, I can't either. It's his responsibility to maintain a relationship with his children, regardless of his relationship with their mother. But he really failed them with that.
He sure did. So Bob knew that his kids smoked marijuana with their friends, and he suspected they took some harder drugs than that. But above all else, he wanted Sharon and did not want to be married to Nancy anymore. So that's the overriding theme.
Yes, that was the big thing. This was pretty much all for Sharon.
Yeah.
And Bob knew that Sharon did not want kids, especially a couple of hand-me-down teenage kids from another marriage. And also he knew divorce could be very expensive. So he felt like he needed to think of another way to get out of his marriage. Something more permanent, perhaps.
And once again, we are faced with a couple that is going to divorce, but, well, a couple that can't live together anymore. And rather than a divorce, we decide that we'll murder the spouse.
It's one of the dumbest things, especially when you say, well, I can't afford a divorce.
Yeah. Or can you afford giving up your life?
Yeah. A life in prison? Yeah. Well, over the days following that Christmas, Bob came up with his alternative to divorce. It was very simple and complete in his mind. He would just eliminate his entire family and start over with Sharon. So once that was decided, he moved forward with some careful planning. The first order of business was to create a diversion at the murder scene. This had to be something to draw attention away from him and onto something else. So he thought there was no better way to do it than to create an argument with his wife in front of some of Susan and David's friends. An argument that would show them just how emotionally unstable Nancy was. So his goal was to make her out to be a woman capable of doing anything. So it was around 8:15 p.m. on December 28, 1978. Two of Susan's friends arrived at the Spangler home. David answered the door and led them upstairs to Susan's room, where Susan and her boyfriend Timothy were listening to the stereo. So they all planned a New Year's Eve party, which would also be a birthday party for Tim. Susan asked her mom if they could have the party at their house, and Nancy agreed. So Bob thought, this is the perfect excuse for an argument with my wife, one where he could accuse her of being too lenient with the kids. So around 10 p.m. that night, when Susan's friends were getting ready to leave, they heard Bob having a loud argument with David and Nancy in the family's kitchen. Bob was yelling and swearing at both of them, especially David, and Nancy looked like she was on the verge of tears. She seemed very distraught, and that's just what Bob wanted her to seem like.
His little scenario is working out.
Unfortunately, yes. So embarrassed, Susan rushed the two girls, her two friends, out the door and said goodbye to them, and then she slipped back into the house. Now feeling like his mission was accomplished, Bob abruptly ended the argument and went to bed. The next day, December 29th, 1978, between 9:30 a.m. and 10 a.m., Susan's boyfriend Tim went over to the Spangler house again to see Susan. He'd cut several hints from Susan the night before that things were not going well between her parents, and she was pretty sure at this point that they would get a divorce.
Then around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Tim noticed that Bob Spangler came home early from work. He even heard Bob apologize to David for last night's argument. But Tim went home for dinner between 5:30 and 6, but returned to the Spangler house around 7:30 and went upstairs to Susan's room. According to Tim later, he and Susan dropped some LSD and listened to music.
Yeah, so Tim stayed with Susan until about 1:30 a.m. on December 30th before he went home. When he left, everything seemed to be all right in the Spangler house. But it wasn't. Bob was already putting his plans into motion for annihilating his entire family. So Bob kept a .38 caliber revolver in a shoebox in the master bedroom closet. He had bought it, he told Nancy, for protection on his motorcycle trips. Even though he was a tall man, 6'1", he put a footstool in front of the closet as if a shorter person were trying to get to the shoebox. Then he took the pistol down to the basement and hid it down there.
See, he's got some careful planning here.
It's very planned out, yeah, which makes it really scary.
So in the early morning hours of December 30, 1978, Bob Spangler went down to the basement and placed a typewritten letter into a Corona typewriter that Nancy often used. The letter was supposed to have been written by her, but he had invented it. It was all his doing. The letter read, "What do I say now that I decided to do this? I found the gun by accident some time ago and couldn't help thinking about this. I don't know why I didn't say anything to you. I feel shattered. We have always argued about who'll have the kids. I will. I know you will get along. You always have." Then at the bottom of this note was a handwritten letter N. And Bob had tricked Nancy into signing her first initial there, telling her that she was signing a Christmas letter that he was going to be typing up.
So Bob went next upstairs, and he asked Nancy to come down into the basement with him. He actually told her he had a surprise for her. So maybe she thought he had a late Christmas present for her. Or maybe she thought Bob was going to give her a gift of apology for that argument they had. But whatever she was thinking, Nancy sat down in a chair next to the table with the typewriter on it. She closed her eyes as Bob told her to. Then Bob pulled the .38 caliber revolver out of hiding and aimed it at his wife's forehead. The barrel was only 3 to 4 inches away from her skull and pointed at about a 40-degree angle downward. As Nancy waited for her surprise, Bob pulled the trigger and fired. The bullet ripped through Nancy's skull and brain, and she slumped over in the chair. Of course, this wound was fatal, but Bob's morning was just getting started. Now, he may have considered just leaving the house right then, but he did decide that Sharon would never want his children. So the one thing he wanted most in his life at that moment was Sharon, and that's all that really mattered to him. So he decided again, yes, the children have to go.
Just chills me.
It does. It's really that someone could do that to their own kids. It's horrible.
So Susan and David were heavy sleepers, especially Saturday mornings like this one. Neither of them had heard the gunshot in the basement. Bob went upstairs to Susan's room and found her asleep on her bed. She was wearing a nightgown and lying on her stomach. He sneaked up as close as he could to the bed and aimed the gun at her back where her heart was. He shot her once, and the bullet entered her heart and killed her almost instantly.
Now that is awful. That makes me feel sick.
Oh, with David, the murder did not go as easily. David was large and strong, so Bob knew that David could be a problem if he was only wounded. So as Bob moved closer to his son, David may have woken up and moved. But whatever the reason, Bob's aim was not so good this time. The bullet hit David off-center near the midline of his sternum. So now David would be awake and in shock, and must have looked at his father in disbelief.
I can't even imagine what he thought at that moment.
Yeah, this good old dad with a smoking handgun.
Yep.
Bob then got ready to fire again, but changed his mind. The fire again was not part of his plan. It's supposed to be one bullet for each victim. So as David's blood began to pour over the sheets, Bob grabbed a pillow from under his son's head and pushed it down over David's face. Must have been a struggle despite David's bleeding wound. He twisted and turned, ended up falling halfway off the bed. And there's blood everywhere, as you can imagine.
Yeah, now David was just as big and strong as his father, if not stronger. But with a bullet wound in his body, he didn't have enough strength to fight back. So Bob smothered his son, and slowly but surely, David stopped moving and then stopped breathing. He was dead now, just like his mother and his sister. Within a very short time, Bob returned to the basement and dropped the gun on the floor a few feet away from Nancy's body. He looked around the room, then he just walked out the door away from this terrible scene. It was around 10:30 a.m. on December 30th when Susan's boyfriend Timothy phoned the Spangler house to talk to Susan. When there was no answer, he decided to go over there and wake her up. Tim knew that she and David were late sleepers on the weekends, so it wasn't really unusual for no one to answer the phone. When he arrived at the Spangler home, he went to the front of the house, but the door was locked. Walking around toward the garage, Tim noticed that the family station wagon was gone and the side door of the house was locked as well. Returning to the front door, he rang the doorbell, but no one answered. He picked up a handful of pebbles then from the neighbor's yard and threw them at Susan's window, but still no one responded. So by this time, losing his patience, he grabbed the Spangler's morning newspaper and threw it at Susan's window. It bounced off the glass, making a loud thud, but still no one responded inside the home. So now, determined to get into the house, Tim went to a basement window, pushed it open, and crawled inside. So it was dark in the basement, and he walked right by Nancy Spangler's body, which was slumped over in a chair, without even knowing she was there. He climbed the basement stairs to the main floor of the house, then went up the stairs to the second floor. Susan's bedroom door was closed, but Tim went inside, and that's when he saw her on the bed. So she actually looked peaceful to him, and he thought she was sleeping. As kind of a joke, he threw his hat and gloves at her to wake her up. But she didn't move. So now he's just beginning to feel concerned, and he moved toward her and saw that she was face down. Her head was buried in her pillow, and she did not appear to be breathing. Incredibly enough, though, there was no blood that he could see, even though a bullet had pierced her heart. So Tim rolled Susan over and felt for a pulse on her neck. Finding none, he panicked and ran into David's room. Flinging open the door, he was hit by a very grisly sight that nearly made him pass out. There was blood everywhere, and David's body was laying sprawled halfway off the bed onto the floor. In a daze now, Tim ran to the primary bedroom and called for the paramedics. Then he waited.
So the first paramedics to arrive were Gary Roberts and Emmett Adams from the Littleton Fire Department. They met Tim inside the Spangler home and followed him up to Susan's and David's rooms. But the two paramedics couldn't do anything to help. Neither of the Spangler children had any vital signs. A few minutes later, Arapahoe County Sheriff Sergeant Gene Martin and two deputies arrived. About David, they wrote that there was a white male covered in blood, lying face down, with his upper torso touching the floor and his feet up on the bed. There were numerous blood pools staining the bottom sheet of the bed. The top bedding was rumpled up at the foot of the bed. His body showed multiple abrasions, mostly around his knees and lower legs, with two linear abrasions about his upper middle shoulders. Once David's body was moved, police saw that he had a single gunshot wound located midline on this upper aspect of his breastbone.
Susan Spangler was lying face up now with her head to the east and her feet to the west. Her bed clothing had been pulled up, covering her chest. There were no signs of a wound then upon first viewing, but it was later learned that she had a single gunshot wound midline, slightly to the left of her back, with no external bleeding. Tim wasn't sure, but they think that he pulled up the blanket to cover her, just as a reflex. Walking to the parents' bedroom, they found one of Bob's little stage touches. There was the step stool in front of the closet, as if someone of small stature had used it to reach the box of .38 caliber ammunition that was kept on the high shelf. So around noontime, Lieutenant Les Murray and Investigator Marv Tucker of the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office arrived at the Spangler home, and they were followed by Deputy Coroner Hamilton. So according to Tucker, Hamilton went downstairs and nearly jumped right out of his skin when he turned on the light and saw the body of Nancy Spangler slumped over in a chair. Now, none of them had any idea that they would find Nancy down there. Nancy was slumped over to her right side with her right arm hanging straight down. Blood was dripping from her nose. Her left arm was in her lap. There was a gunshot wound to her head. In front of the chair there was a round table with a small typewriter on it, and on top of the typewriter there was a typewritten note. So this, of course, was the fake suicide note that Bob had typed for the investigator to find, and to attribute to his wife Nancy. A Smith & Wesson Model 12.3 2-inch barreled 6-shot revolver was found about 5.5 feet from Nancy's body. That weapon had 3 fired rounds and 3 live rounds. And there was a man's sock covering half of the grip. So it wasn't until 4:45 p.m. when Bob Spangler returned to his house and found yellow police tape marking off the yard. The street was lined with law enforcement vehicles and even TV news vans. So Bob knew this would have to be the performance of his life. He was met at the door by Sergeant Martin, who talked to him for a moment and told him to wait out in his vehicle. Then Bob was driven down to the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office for questioning. And once there, he was taken into a room for an interview. So Bob had taken all day to concoct a story, and he began to tell it then.
Bob told the investigators that he and his wife had argued on December 29th, and he told her he was planning on leaving her. In the morning, she and Bob woke up and went downstairs. Their argument continued. At about 8:30 that morning, Nancy told Bob to leave the house. He put on his jacket and left the house through the back sliding glass doors, crossed the backyard, went over a fence to the back of King's Superstore. He said that he walked down South University to the South Glen Mall, walked around there for a while. He said he was gone for about an hour and a half, returned to the house, crossed the fence through the backyard, and went straight into the garage. He didn't go inside the house at that time. He got into his car and drove around. So he told the police that he'd been driving around Denver, listening to the Broncos football game on the radio. Then he went to see a movie, The Lord of the Rings, at a theater in the University Hills Shopping Center. After the movie, he'd driven home to find all the police at his house. I'm not real impressed with that alibi.
Oh no, and it changes. That's the fun thing.
So Bob agreed to take a trace metal detection gunshot residue test, but the testing technician was a friend of Bob's. His name was Jack Swanberg. They had worked together in conjunction with the Honeywell Corporation before Swanberg moved on to become a lab tech for Arapahoe County. In fact, Bob was also the coach for Swanberg's son's soccer league. As Swanberg did the tests, he was looking for traces of gunshot residue on Bob's hands and clothing. Gunshot residues are composed of soot, lead, barium, and antimony from the discharging cartridge primer compound. The soot portion contains mainly graphite dust. The trace elements of lead, barium, and antimony mainly come from the discharging primer's explosive compound. So when a gun's fired, there's a small puff of soot over the chamber area. This puff of GSR is usually deposited over the shooter's hand that holds the weapon. And the palm, though, is usually without this residue because it's gripping the butt of the pistol, while the web and the back of the hand are coated with residue. So someone who picks up a gun after it's been fired can get gunshot residue on the palm of the hand. In Bob Spangler's case, he did seem to have trace elements of GSR on the webbing and backside of his hand, but he also had GSR on both palms as well.
So that's kind of interesting, huh?
Well, I wonder if he had researched this, so he has an answer. If they say, oh, he had gunshot residue on his hands, yeah, but they're on the palms too.
Right, yeah, well, at first, though, he wasn't even saying that he'd touched the gun.
Yeah.
So, following the completion of the gunshot residue test, Bob was taken to Bullock's mortuary, where he identified the bodies of Nancy, Susan, and David. After that was done, he was taken back to the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office. Jack Swanberg did speak up and told the investigators that he was a friend of Bob's. He also said that Bob didn't have any relatives in the area, and Swanberg had asked if it would be all right if Bob stayed at his home that night. So even though this is highly irregular, there were no objections from the investigators that day. And the next day, December 31st, Jack Swanberg told investigators that Bob was willing to take a polygraph test. So Swanberg took Bob to Ralph Severance's office. That was inside the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office. And Bob at that point seemed excited to take the test. But he was acting very agitated and even hyperventilating. So Severance determined then that Bob was in no condition to take the test. He didn't want him to take it that day, told him to go home. But before he left, Bob said, "I'll take the test at a later time if it's okay with my attorney." By then, he'd hired an attorney named John Burns. At 9:30 the same morning, investigators went to meet Dr. John Wood, the chief coroner. As Dr. Wood began the autopsy on Nancy, he explained to the investigators that the broken capillaries on her right wrist could have been caused by the recoil from the firing of the pistol. The dark spots that collected there were known as Tardieu spots. He said that a person her size could have suffered bruising if she was not used to firing a pistol. So, as to the bullet wound in her forehead, he noted, a bullet entrance area is seen in the right frontal bone. There's evidence of metallic tracking through the right hemisphere with an exit site in the right occipital bone, almost at the midline. So the occipital bone, if someone does not know that, is the lower back of the head.
Back of your head.
Yep. So, of course, the suicide note was examined and compared with several typewritten and handwritten examples from Nancy. Some were from checks that she had cashed. The capital N written in ink was determined to have been written by the same person as on the canceled checks, initialed N. Spangler. Shortly after the autopsies were completed on Nancy, David, and Susan, their remains were cremated. And of course this request came from Bob Spangler himself. Now their bodies could not be disinterred later if any further testing was indicated.
Yeah, nothing to test.
Nope.
So the GSR swabs from Nancy did set off some alarms. The amount of antimony found was not sufficient to indicate the presence of GSR. No powder pattern was found either, which would have indicated close muzzle contact with her skin. However, the amount of barium and antimony found on the right palm of Bob Spangler were sufficient to indicate GSR. The results were consistent with his handling the gun with his right hand. Now, the typewriter was also examined, and distinct wipe marks were found, as if someone had wiped off fingerprints. So with these results, Bob was brought back to the sheriff's office for further questioning. He came in with his attorney on February 1st and was interviewed by investigators. He was read his rights and said that he did want to make a statement. Interestingly, this statement varied from his original statement in several aspects, as you mentioned.
Yeah, so that would make me think at least the police had to have some idea that he was likely responsible for this.
Well, yeah.
So first, Bob contradicted his earlier statement about arguing with his wife on the morning of December 30th. Now he said he had barely spoken with her that morning. He said he went down to the kitchen for breakfast and that Nancy had ordered him to leave the house. So he grabbed his coat and left through the back door, climbing over the back fence. Bob then went on to add new details about his absence from the home between 9 and 10 a.m. He said he had walked to the King Soopers shopping center, then walked around and back to his house. Once there, he opened the garage and drove away. But before exiting the subdivision, Bob said, he decided that he really should go back and discuss things with Nancy. So he went back and pulled into the driveway, walking through the garage into the family room. Bob said that he noticed the basement door was ajar at that time and that the basement light was on. So he said he walked down the stairs around the corner where he saw Nancy sitting in the chair with her head slumped forward and blood dripping from her head. He said he walked over to the table, noticed the gun on the floor, partly covered with a sock over the grip. So he reached down and picked up the gun with his right hand. He said that he did have the gun in both of his hands at some point, but he stepped back and dropped it on the floor. He then left by going back upstairs and back through the garage. So Bob said he just felt like he needed to get away from there, and he showed no concern for his children's well-being and no concern for them if they just happened to find their mother dead in the basement. So he must have known something about that GSR and decided, well, I have to have handled that gun. So he changed his story.
Yeah. I wonder how much he gleaned from his friend who was running the test.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Right? Yep. I would think a lot. If he went and spent the night at the guy's house, it's just so inappropriate. It's really bad, actually.
Yeah, it's not a good move.
No, and I think they kind of knew it, but just decided to let it go. Because Swanberg did bring it up, so he knew it was very questionable at the least.
Yeah.
Yeah. So according to Bob, he spent the rest of that day driving around Denver and listening to the Denver Broncos football game on the car radio. He said he ate lunch at Burger King and then went to see a movie. While at the movie, though, he began to worry about seeing Nancy and not calling anyone. He didn't stay for the end of the movie, but went back to his house. So when he says he began to worry about seeing Nancy and not calling anyone, there's no worry about Nancy being dead or his children maybe coming across it, or maybe his children were killed too, especially if he looked at the note, right?
He wouldn't know, would he?
No, but the note that he left indicated that she'd done something to the children, right? Because she said that she would have them.
Right.
So Bob said he was embarrassed about lying to the police on December 30th, right after his family's deaths. He said he'd just been afraid because he'd seen Nancy and had left the house without calling anyone. Then he said he would like to take a polygraph.
And then on February 28th, he actually did take a polygraph. It was performed by a private firm, but Bob sabotaged this test by controlling his breathing and hyperventilating on all the questions. He even went about his name and the date. So this shenanigan skewed the test so that the examiner could not make a proper determination about deception. He was retested in early March, but again he hyperventilated throughout the test. The police report recorded that his actions appeared to be voluntary.
I'm sure. I don't know when they started it why they would even continue if that was happening, because it's just a waste of people's time. And it also indicates guilt, in my opinion. So the gloves that Bob had been wearing on December 30th were tested, and it was noted that there was GSR on the palms of both the right and left glove. Of course the police were skeptical of Bob's stories, that's to say the least, because he would tell one story and then he would change or add details. No one really doubted that the capital N on the suicide note was from Nancy, but the checks and other items provided to police for comparison did all come from Bob. Nancy's father and stepmother were, of course, devastated to learn that their daughter and their 2 grandchildren were dead. They were simply told that Nancy had shot her children and herself. Nancy's brother, David Fitch, suspected Bob from the beginning. He said, Nancy weighed about 100 pounds, so it makes no sense that she could have overpowered her 17-year-old son.
Not likely.
No. Nancy's father said that Nancy hated guns and was not comfortable handling them at all. Then when Bob's mother heard the news, she had a massive stroke and she died back in Iowa.
Wow.
So you don't just have 3 people dying here. You have the domino effect throughout the family.
Yeah, you do. But while family members grieved and suffered, Bob was now free to be with the woman he wanted. That's Sharon Cooper.
Well, I guess that's the important thing here, right?
If you're Bob.
Yeah.
Now, within just days of the deaths of his family, Sharon moved into Bob's house. God.
I know.
If she was disturbed by moving into this death house, she didn't let anyone know about her feelings. She had Bob all to herself, and they both seemed content with that.
Now, I wouldn't suggest that Sharon knew about this, but I would suggest that that's poor judgment. She should have at least been suspicious of this whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The man you're having an affair with, his whole family is suddenly killed in one day. And even if Nancy had killed herself and the children, moving into that house seems super inappropriate because it's still a tragedy.
Yeah, you say you don't think she had any knowledge of his plan.
Right.
I'm thinking she might have.
She might have. I mean, yeah. I don't know for sure.
I just can't see somebody. The 2 things that bother me are, first, that she even moved into the house.
Yes.
Because I wouldn't.
No, I wouldn't either.
And the second is that she did this within days of the deaths.
I know. Isn't it horrific? Well, he really never did show any emotion over their deaths.
No.
No. So the neighbors found it very odd that Bob's wife and children were barely cold before this new woman moved in with the widower. Also, Nancy had loved and doted on her children, and no one could imagine that she would have killed them. The situation was even more shocking a few days later as neighbors watched Sharon and Bob drag Nancy's belongings out into the driveway and had a yard sale, for Christ's sake. It's disgusting. It really just seemed like they were trying to erase her existence completely. But, it did look like Bob was getting away with 3 murders at that point.
Yeah, he's not been arrested. He's just been spoken to.
Yeah. So Bob was 46 years old when he eliminated his family and moved Sharon into their home. He did not appear to dwell on their loss at all, but seemed to kind of shrug it off and move purposefully forward. If his life with Nancy and the kids reminded him of getting older and of his limitations, Sharon made him feel renewed. Sharon was his match in physical fitness. She taught yoga and was very slender. She kept fit and exercised daily. Sharon adopted 3 dogs and she loved them like her children. So Sharon may not have been a children person, as Bob had said, but she was a dog person.
She's younger than Bob, I take it.
Yes. I don't think stunningly so, but yes. She wasn't 20 or something, but she was a bit younger.
So one of his acquaintances noticed a growing egotistical streak in Bob after the death of Nancy. She wondered how much of it had to do with Sharon. But by far the most shared interest between Bob and Sharon was hiking in the Grand Canyon. It was the one place where Sharon felt she could go to escape the demons that tormented her mental health. There was something about the remoteness of the canyon that soothed Sharon's nerves. So she and Bob got married in July 1979, which was less than a year after the deaths of his family. For a honeymoon, they took a long motorcycle trip to the West Coast, and Sharon talked him into stopping by the Grand Canyon on the way home. This was only 7 months after the murders of Nancy, Susan, and David. But as far as Bob was concerned, his marriage to Nancy and the birth of his 2 children was a faint memory because he had Sharon by his side.
He'd gotten what he wanted. So as she kept sliding and slipping on the rough hermit trail of the Grand Canyon, which led down steeply toward the Colorado River, Bob kept giving Sharon advice on how to hike the trail. He told her this trail had once been a main thoroughfare to the canyon, but that had been many years ago. It was rough and poorly marked now, and it was slippery with loose rocks and crumbling stone. But despite these dangers, Bob really enjoyed the hike. There was an incident on a backpack trip on the Hermit Trail that gave a glimpse into Bob's dark side. So, on this hike, a 19-year-old man had fallen 40 feet off a cliff on the wall of Hermit Canyon. Both of his ankles were broken and he was in a lot of pain. But Bob was clearly more concerned about playing the hero than he was about this young man's well-being. Bob took a mirror from Sharon and trekked up to an unmanned ranger cabin where he signaled until sunset. His flashes were seen on the rim and help did finally arrive. Bob later talked about his part in this incident pretty much to anyone who would listen. He was so excited about his role above the severity of this boy's fall. Unfortunately for Sharon, on the day after this episode, she had a nervous breakdown in the canyon. She suddenly began crying as she hiked along the trail, and she just couldn't stop. So Bob was probably annoyed. She told him to leave her and go on ahead, so he did. So Sharon finished the hike alone, sobbing for 2 miles. And Bob showed no concern for her, but was irritated that the hike had been hindered by her emotional break. Unknown to Sharon, Bob noted a particularly dangerous section of that trail for his future use. It was in fact the perfect spot for a murder. Someone could be pushed from there and no one could say that it wasn't an accident. Just one small shove could send them plummeting to their death, as the fall was sure to be fatal. Intricate details like that were tucked away in Bob's memory, just in case they might be useful someday. After all, he was a planner, and he was one to think over all of the details.
In 1986, Bob Spangler was tired of working for a living. His elderly father was 92 years old, and as long as the old man lived, Bob could not touch the substantial estate that Marilyn had at his advanced age. But the guy still didn't show any signs of faltering, at least until Bob showed up that spring for a visit. And within a short time of Bob's arrival, Marilyn had a serious fall. 2 weeks later, he was dead. It's never been proven if there's any correlation between Bob's visit and his adoptive father's death. But after Marilyn died, Bob received a hefty amount of money from the estate, and he was able to retire. It was only much later that law enforcement authorities would notice his trip to Iowa that year, and the fact that people close to Bob Spangler seemed to die at unexpected times. Underlined on a memo were the words, "Merlin Spangler died under suspicious circumstances when Robert Spangler had been visiting in Ames, Iowa."
So that's pretty shocking, huh? By 1987, Sharon no longer seemed to be the dream woman for whom Bob had murdered his family. Their lives were drifting apart, and not even the Grand Canyon trips could keep them together. On December 4th, 1987, Sharon called her therapist, Dr. Bell. Her call was frantic and incoherent. She said she was afraid of Bob and may have even indicated suicidal tendencies. Dr. Bell was concerned enough to phone the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office and have them send a deputy over to investigate the Spangler household. He told them, "Mrs. Spangler has been despondent and may need to be placed into the hospital." But just as an officer reached the area, he got a radio message that Sharon was seen at the nearby King Soopers Market, and she was acting very erratically. Sharon was in fact hysterical and hiding from her husband Bob at the market. She claimed he had threatened her. Sharon had run into the store claiming that her husband had taken her car keys so she couldn't leave. She said she was afraid that he might harm her. She ran into the storeroom at the back of the store and was hiding out there. She was so frantic that she asked for a bag to be placed over her head so no one would recognize her. 2 officers were able to subdue her as she struggled and screamed at them. Then she was taken by ambulance to the hospital for a mental health evaluation. She ended up staying overnight, and she told one therapist that her husband was trying to get her. And if she spoke to Dr. Bell about this, the information stayed locked away with his records. They were protected by doctor-client privilege. So Sharon did clearly have some mental health issues, but the fact that she was running away from Bob does give you pause, considering everything else going on in his life.
Yeah, by late December 1987, it was clear that the marriage of Bob and Sharon was beyond repair. Bob told his friend and hiking buddy Jim Looks like Sharon and I will be taking the divorce trail in 1988. It promises to be as amicable and non-acrimonious as these things can be. Bob told Jim that Sharon would remain in the house with him for the time being. He said it was uncomfortable, but not awful. By April of 1988, Bob was telling Jim that the divorce was being finalized and they were both anxious to get on with their lives.
Yeah, but in the end, Bob was not happy with the divorce settlement. Bob had to pay Sharon $500 a month until February 1990. So from that time until July 1997, he would have to pay her $400 a month. Sharon was to give up all claims to the house on South Franklin Way, but she was to receive $150,000 in compensation from stocks and bonds that Bob owned. Sharon soon moved out of Bob's home on South Franklin Way, but the two did stay in touch, and Bob bought himself a new house in Denver. Once he was settled there, he began dating several women, but he also placed an ad in a Denver area singles newspaper. And this ad caught the eye of a woman named Donna Sundling, who lived in nearby Evergreen. She answered Bob's ad and agreed to meet him at a local bar. So at this time, Donna was living in a posh suburb in the mountains. She'd been divorced since 1974, but now it was 1989 and she was eager to find a companion. Her first date with Bob went very well. She was petite and pretty and about the same age as he was. He was 56 at this time. She was the mother of 5 grown children, and she still worked as an accountant. So Bob made plans to introduce Donna to the Grand Canyon that fall. Bruce Sundling, Donna's son, described her as self-sacrificing, caring, gentle, and protective. Bob eventually told Donna his version of what had happened on South Franklin Way. It was the standard lie that Nancy had killed the children and then herself.
Now, to supplement his retirement, Bob went back to working for the American Water Works Association again. He raised money for them in public relations. In the back of his mind, there must have been a thought that he was still paying Sharon's support. Always tight with money, he must have been quite put out that he had to give her anything. With Donna around, though, Bob soon quit talking about Sharon and money and became more positive, speaking of Donna as a potential wife. But Bob's first trip to the Grand Canyon with Donna didn't turn out as well as planned. Donna banged up her knee about a week before, so she had a bit of a built-in handicap on the way down, especially since she was not used to carrying a pack. And unfortunately for both of them, Bob didn't realize that Donna was mainly putting up a good front for him, because the truth was that she was frightened of hiking in the Grand Canyon. Even though she was an athlete, she was prone to dizzy spells, and she was definitely afraid of heights. So that's a good place to be visiting, huh? Grand Canyon?
Basically, my worst nightmare is someone afraid of heights.
But for the time being, she kept this information from Bob because she knew how much she loved the place.
Well, after just a short courtship, they were married in August of 1990 at Donna's home in Evergreen, Colorado. About 50 people attended the reception, and you could tell Donna obviously loved Bob. They decided they were going to keep her house and sell his and travel around in a Winnebago. But things did not work out that way. It turned out in many ways Donna was a lot like Nancy. He seemed to control things that went on in the Spangler house. And Donna was so in love with him that she was willing to go wherever he went, even if it meant moving away from a community that she really loved. So, September of 1991, Bob sold their house in Evergreen and bought a new place in Durango. Bob tried to have Donna sign her portion of this new home completely over in his name alone. They eventually, though, did have both their names placed on the title, so she did stand up to him that one time. But soon after, Donna wrote up a will that stated if she did die before Bob, he was to have her share of the house in Durango. Then Bob decided to become a radio DJ in the Durango area. He tried out for the morning spot on the country and western station, KRSJ, and got the job. Then Bob began working mornings, Monday through Friday, on a regular basis. He had such a well-respected reputation in Durango that no one questioned his honesty as he told one lie after another. In fact, he lied his way through life in Durango as he spoke on the radio and refereed at soccer games. Donna ended up loving Durango too, and the people she worked with. But because of her work and Bob's early morning hours, it did start to cause a strain on their marriage.
And before long, the Spanglers were leading separate lives. Donna did not want it to be that way, but she found it hard to share Bob's interests, and he became increasingly annoyed with her. And then Bob discovered the most annoying fact of all. Donna did not love hiking in the Grand Canyon. She was afraid of the slippery, steep trails at the canyon and afraid of losing her balance. She was afraid of the place that he loved the most. And if there was a common bond left between Bob and Donna during this period, it was their love of Durango. Bob was always volunteering for some kind of sports activity. He even helped announce a couple of the local high school football games. The only real complaint Bob had about his new life in Durango was that his schedule at the radio station kept him from taking off to the Grand Canyon whenever he wanted.
So the strain in her marriage with Bob led Donna to seek counseling. Not much of what she said there is known, but a few glimpses of what she was thinking made their way into police reports later on. These insights came from friends and family. Donna was depressed and said that there was a lot of loneliness in her marriage to Bob. She never felt that she had a good connection with him. She loved him, but he was very set in his ways. She also worried about a Durango woman who used to come over to their house for barbecues. Bob would flirt with the woman more than what seemed appropriate, and Donna wondered if maybe they were having an affair. But more than anything else, it was Donna's lack of passion for the Grand Canyon that really bothered Bob and made her feel left out of his life. As he noted later, the magic had gone out of their marriage. He would say that marrying her was actually a mistake. And when he had thoughts like that, we know that Bob could be very dangerous. So there was a Christmas party at the Spanglers' house in 1992. To all outside appearances, they seemed like a loving, happy couple. But at some point at the party, Donna mentioned how the Grand Canyon had become an issue in their marriage. She confided in a friend that she was very afraid of sheer drop-offs because she had poor balance, which sounds reasonable to me.
Yes, it does.
She had to take meclizine for dizziness. Bob was not happy with the way things were going either. During the Christmas holiday that year, Donna's sons and relatives visited their house often. And there was one other thing bothering Bob. In January 1993, he turned 60 years old. He said he knew he was entering a new part of his life and that his energy was not what it had been. And Bob was terrified of growing old.
Yeah, it's an inevitable thing.
Absolutely, but he didn't like it. Not that any of us like it. But by the spring of 1993, Bob was once again restless. He was bored with his wife, and he was tired of his job. There were many things he still wanted to do, and now Donna just seemed like an albatross around his neck, pulling him down. By that April, the discontent was back for Bob, and he began to have thoughts of murder again.
Yeah, if Donna's holding him back, Bob knew that he had rid himself of this problem before. He had been questioned about all the deaths and had always been let go. He felt like he had fooled everyone. So Bob pleaded and guilted Donna, trying to get her to come with him to the Grand Canyon for a backpack trip during Easter week. It would be their 4-year anniversary since meeting in 1989, and it was something he wanted to do, and he was very adamant about her coming with him. Donna told her friend Joan McCabe about this and said she didn't want to go. She also called her friend Sandy Brooks. Donna told her she was scared about the trip, but excited as well. Brooks told her that if she was scared, she didn't have to go. But Donna said that it was important to Bob that she accompany him.
Yeah, so I guess we have to admit he was a skilled manipulator, because Donna was not a stupid woman.
No.
But he was able to get her to do this. And she was so nervous about the upcoming trip to the canyon that she called each of her children before leaving, all 5 of them. She didn't mention that she was afraid of Bob, but she did say she was afraid of hiking in the Grand Canyon. A couple of her children were worried about her and had the feeling that she was saying goodbye to them. They were really unsettled by the tone of her voice that day. So once they were at the Grand Canyon on April 9th, 1993, Bob and Donna hiked down the Grandview Trail from the South Rim to Horseshoe Mesa. This was an established trail used by many hikers in all seasons. At a certain point, though, Bob led her off onto the unmaintained and difficult Page Springs Trail to Hants Creek, where they camped for the night. The trail was rough going for Donna, and Bob was not happy about it. The next day they made their way along the Page Springs Trail, which was not easy. Donna was not a strong hiker, and this really must have been terrifying for her. There seemed to be almost nothing they shared in common anymore, and as they hiked along the trail, they met up with a group of 4 hikers. They were surprised when Bob told them that he and Donna were planning to camp that night on Horseshoe Mesa near the old mine shaft. They knew this area was off limits to camping, and they were sure that Bob knew that as well. So they wondered why he would pick such a remote spot to camp.
I suppose Bob has his reasons.
Yes, he sure does.
So at some point along the trail, the 4 other hikers split off from Bob and Donna and went their own way for the night. Bob and Donna struggled into camp near the old mine and camped illegally at its entrance. Bob knew that this place was off limits to campers, so he also knew that no one would be around to see what happened next. He couldn't go on living life the way it was with Donna. In his mind, she restricted him. The next morning, April 11th, 1993, was Easter Sunday and the 4th anniversary of Bob's meeting Donna back in Denver. Bob woke up early and decided what he must do. Just like with Nancy and the kids, Donna had to go. Bob had learned from his divorce with Sharon that divorce could be very expensive, but there were ways around divorce, especially if you had no conscience.
Yeah, those consciences can be pesky.
Can't they?
It really frees you up when you don't have one.
So Bob and Donna left camp around 8:30 in the morning. They climbed 2 steep switchbacks above the mine shaft, and as they paused to take a breath, Bob knew there was no place above this spot where a fall off the trail was certain to cause death. So it's now or never. The spot he picked to kill Donna had a cliffside which was only about 25 to 30 feet high, but right below the cliff was a steep rocky chute that fell another 100 feet. Anyone falling off the cliff and into the chute would have little to zero chance of survival.
Yeah, Bob acted fast before the other hikers might travel along the trail. His choice of the previous night's campsite had been key because no one would be in the area that early in the morning. As Donna stood on the edge of the precipice, breathing hard and looking at him, Bob moved forward and reached toward her. Maybe she thought he was going to adjust her pack for her or give her a hug. But Bob reached out and shoved her over the cliff, so it's really hard to imagine what Donna thought at that moment. The horror of it.
Yeah.
The unexpectedness of it must have been shocking. Her worst fears had been realized. She'd always been terrified of falling from a great height at the Grand Canyon, and now she was falling. She fell 25 feet before hitting the first rocks, and her straw hat flew off. Then she tumbled another 100 feet down the rocky chute. The trail at the spot where he pushed Donna over the edge was very rocky and slippery. His momentum almost carried him over with her. He skidded and slipped and came within inches of tumbling over the side too. But then Bob felt relief of having gotten rid of Donna without anyone seeing it, and he'd survived. But now he had to make sure that Donna was dead. Bob found an alternate route down to where Donna's body was lying. It was steep and treacherous, but he was able to make it. Once he got to her, he discovered she had multiple bruises and contusions all over her body, and blood was oozing from multiple head wounds. Bob knelt down and checked for vital signs. Donna was dead. Bob noticed that items had broken free from her backpack and were strewn about and down the steep slope. For some reason, he washed her face, covered it with a red bandana, and put a blue tarp over her body. Then he climbed back up the slope, threw her backpack behind some rocks, and began to put together the story that he would tell the park rangers once he reached the backcountry office on the south rim. And then Bob came upon the 4 hikers that he and Donna had been with the day before. He ran past them and then stopped, standing by the edge of the trail and catching his breath and crying. One of the hikers, Kevin, told Bob he could walk to the top of the trail with him, and they took off together. On the way, Bob did not discuss Donna's accident very much, but he did mention to Kevin he didn't know why he had run up the trail since Donna was already dead. It seemed like an odd comment. Then Bob's remark at the top of the trail was even more odd. Bob said, "Hey, I'm taking a hike in the canyon next November. Would you like to be my hiking partner?"
How would you respond to that?
He didn't know how to respond to that. It's just crazy. So about 11:30 that morning, Ranger Dolly McHenry at the backcountry office looked up and she saw a man with a gray beard patiently waiting in line for his turn, Bob Spangler. So when Bob, dressed in hiking gear, reached the booth, he said in a calm voice, "Yes, please, can you help me? My wife has fallen off the red wall on Horseshoe Mesa. She fell to her death." So McHenry was taken aback by the man's matter-of-fact tone and thought he was in a state of shock. He showed no emotion about his wife's death whatsoever. The strange man went on to say that he and his wife had stopped to take a photo at the trail above the old mine. He said that as she posed for a picture, she fell. He said that he had rushed down to her body and found her dead, and he had washed her face and covered her body with the tarp. The Park Service had Bob fill out a report. He wrote, "We struck camp early, had breakfast, and got on the trail about 8:30 a.m. About half an hour later, we reached a promontory on a switchback and paused for one last photo down the drainage. I positioned Donna and turned to mount the camera on a rock for an automatic picture of us. I heard a small sound from Donna and turned, and she was gone. I looked over the edge and saw her some 200 feet below, up against a small tree. I dropped my pack and ran back down the trail to a point where I could traverse to where she was. There was no pulse. Her legs were badly broken. I pulled her into a better position, got some water from her pack, which had broken free, and washed her face with her bandana. Then I covered her with our blue ground cloth. I carried her pack back to where I dropped mine for some reason, then tossed it up behind some bushes and walked out."
Then at 11:45 in the morning, Sheriff's Deputy Brett Rye was notified of Donna Spangler's death. He arrived at the backcountry office on the South Rim at noon and spoke to Ranger Ken Phillips about the accident. 20 minutes later, Rye and Ranger Jeff Cracked began interviewing Bob about Donna's fall. Bob told them that Donna wasn't much of a hiker and that she was feeling shaky and a little dizzy that morning. Then he began to repeat to them what he had already written in his report. At 11:45 a.m., Sheriff's Deputy Brett Rye was notified of Donna Spangler's death. He arrived at the backcountry office on the South Rim at noon and spoke to Ranger Ken Phillips about the incident. 20 minutes later, Rye and Ranger Jeff Cracked began interviewing Bob about Donna's fall. Bob told them that Donna wasn't much of a hiker and that she was feeling shaky and a little dizzy that morning. Then he began to repeat to them what he had already written in his report.
So about 12:30, Deputy Rye informed the Sheriff's Sergeant, Raul Asqueda, about the fatal accident. 3 minutes later, the coroner, Dr. Littleton, gave Rye permission to remove Donna's body from the site. But by now the winds were howling around the Grand Canyon, and it would be too dangerous to fly a helicopter into the inner canyon to lift her body. So rangers would have to hike down there instead and secure the scene. It took them over 4 hours to hike down to Donna's body. Once there, they located her under a tarp against a tree. Lifting the tarp, they saw that Donna's face was covered with a red bandana, just as Bob Spangler had said. Assorted items belonging to her were scattered, showing the point from which she had fallen. The distance from the point was 160 feet. A story that could not later be verified by park officials was interesting. A man who claimed to be a friend of one of the rangers who checked on Donna that day said that his friend bent down for a closer look at her hands. The ranger didn't believe Bob's story about the fall being an accident, and he checked underneath her fingernails to see if she had scratched him. If there were bits of skin from Bob under her fingernails, it could mean that she'd been fighting him off during an attack, but the ranger would find no bits of skin there. The fatal shove had come so unexpectedly that Donna did not have any time to do anything. But because of the winds, it was impossible to fly into the park with the search and rescue helicopter. So 2 rangers had to spend all night with Donna's body. Then at 7 a.m. on April 12th, a helicopter flew to the scene. While flying above, they videotaped the area and took still photos. Once they were on the ground, 3 men hiked to the point where Donna fell off the trail. Deputy Rye took notes, and he wrote, "The initial fall appeared to be approximately 25 to 30 feet, where she landed on some rocks, and then continued down a chute for a total distance of approximately 140 feet. The victim was visible from the point of the fall. At the base of the rock ledge at the beginning of the chute was her straw hat. Near the final resting place of the victim was another wool glove and a ski pole used as a walking stick."
Around 10 o'clock in the morning, when she was placed in a body bag, slung by cable beneath the helicopter, and carried out to a helipad, her body was driven to the morgue in Flagstaff, which was about 60 miles away. While all of this was going on, investigators had been talking to Bob Spangler. Bob said that Donna had been taking meclizine for vertigo.
Yeah, the same day the autopsy of Donna Spangler was done. In his notes, the ME reported that there were multiple recent abrasions and contusions on her body. There was an abrasion and contusion over her forehead with small lacerations on the right side. The report went on to mention numerous lacerations and contusions all the way down Donna's body. Manipulation of her torso showed multiple bilateral rib and sternum fractures. Her head was abnormally mobile from the neck due to fractures. So the vast number of wounds showed just how violent her fall had been. There were multiple wounds serious enough to have caused her death. The ME wrote at the end of the report, "Cause of death, multiple traumatic injuries. Manner of death, accidental." The police report read, "As the result of follow-up investigation by Deputy Brett Rye, which is consistent with medical examination, it has been determined that there appears to be no foul play and cause of death is accidental. Therefore, this case will be reclassified to close. Disposition, case closed, non-crime."
So he's thinking, I got away with it.
Well, Bob was really helped in his murder that year by the fact that there were so many fatal falls around the Grand Canyon. 1993 was actually one of the worst years on record for accidental falls from the rim. At Cape Royal, German tourist Andreas Zimmermann, 24 years old, was jumping from one ledge to another when he lost his balance and fell 400 feet to his death. Within a couple of days, Lori Newcomb, 31 years old, walked far out on the edge to take a photo near the same spot. A rock crumbled under her feet and she fell 150 feet to her death. These people are just insane to me, I guess. Why would you even do that? Jump from one to the other?
No,
That's insane, yeah. I realize some people just don't have that fear, but still, you have to have some common sense. And some people don't.
I would think.
Yeah.
So after Donna's death, Bob didn't waste any time moving on. Within a noticeably short time, he had her remains cremated, just as he had done to Nancy, Susan, and David. And his cremation was done before any of Donna's children, remember she had 5 grown children, before any of her kids arrived and could have a say. One relative was very angry by the quickness of the cremation, so once again, no body that could be exhumed later for analysis.
Well, the memorial service for Donna was held at the Spangler house in Durango, and it was pretty much considered a farce as far as many people were concerned. For all his methodical planning, this was one thing that Bob did not do well. At the memorial service, Bob gave the eulogy, but he never even cried. He seemed so matter-of-fact that many people found it bizarre. One of the most critical people at the Spangler home that day was a neighbor from across the street. As he watched Bob among the family members and guests, seeking attention, he noted Bob's complete obsession with himself. He seemed to have no grief at all for Donna. The man turned to his wife and he whispered, "I'll bet you he did it. He pushed her over the side." Unfortunately, though, neither this man nor his wife went to the police with their suspicions.
Yeah, well, they're just suspicions. He doesn't have anything concrete.
I know, but maybe just mention the other things that have gone on in case they don't know. As time went on, Donna's death was written off, though, as just one more tragedy in Bob Spangler's tragic life. After all, the Grand Canyon was a dangerous place, and Donna had been prone to dizzy spells. Of course, Bob didn't take long to repeat those facts to anyone who would listen. But still, people had to wonder why a man who would take his wife on such dangerous trails, especially if she suffered from dizziness and balance problems. That makes no sense if he cared about her.
Does not, does it?
No.
Donna's friends in Evergreen held a celebration of life in her honor, something Donna had wanted. Bob didn't attend. He said the celebration should be for her friends in Evergreen, and that he had already held a memorial service in Durango. A friend of Donna's said she told him that her husband had died, and she knew he must feel very lonely in his big house in Durango without Donna. In reply, Bob said, "Oh no, I have the dogs to keep me company." Now this upset her friend so much that she just hung up on Bob.
Oh, no kidding. What a fucker. So December 1st, 1993, Bob was actually quoted in USA Today in a story headlined, "An Edge of Tragedy Amid Canyon Majesty." So the story began by saying that the last time Robert Spangler saw his wife alive, he was setting up his camera, and she was posing for one final snapshot at the Grand Canyon National Park. He told them that she wasn't a very strong hiker. "I don't know," he said, "if she became unbalanced with her backpack, or if she shuffled her feet, or stepped on a rock that became loose. I turned around and she was gone. People that visit simply forget how spectacularly dangerous it can be." The article went on to detail the deaths of 6 other people who had fallen in the Grand Canyon that year. This was as many deaths as the past 3 years combined. Park officials said they couldn't remember a worse year, and of course all of this helped back up Bob's story of an accidental death.
Well, strangely, by July 1994, Bob is letting Sharon, remember her?
Second wife.
Wife number 2?
Mm-hmm.
Letting Sharon move back into his house as a paying boarder. It's not clear why Bob did this. Cynics who knew what had happened to his other spouses surmised that it was a way to get her close, have her drop her guard, and finally eliminate her from his life.
Yeah, but the truth was likely more complicated. He had found it difficult to cut all ties with her. Sharon did write a relative after moving into Bob's house, "I'll stay here until I've had time to heal from all the harsh and sad events of the past half-century." And in the same letter she wrote about how she and Bob were going over her financial situation and he was giving her advice. But at that point, Sharon only had about 5 months to live. Bob had always benefited financially from the deaths of his wives and ex-wives. If Sharon was out of the way, he wouldn't have to pay her the $5,000 he'd promised in mid-1995, or the $400 a month he had to pay her until 1997. And he'd receive a $20,000 that had been stipulated in the divorce settlement if she died before him. So in 1994, Bob was feeling quite confident that he had fooled everyone again. By October of that year, Bob was right in the middle of another unexpected death. So just how much he participated in Sharon's suicide has never been proven. But soon after she died, he was telling people varied stories about the circumstances of her death, just as he had done after the deaths of Nancy, Susan, and David. To the authorities, he told how he had brought Sharon to the hospital as soon as he realized that she had taken a deadly mixture of pills and alcohol. But that's not what he told his close friend, Jim Ullman. Jim would later recall, "Within a couple of days of Sharon's death, Bob called me to break the news. He said that he knew she was home because her car was in the driveway, and that on entering the house, he noted that the door to her bedroom was closed. He said he didn't try to bother her at the time. And later, how much later he didn't say, he saw a note taped to the outside of her bedroom door. The note supposedly said, 'I did it this time.' After reading it, Bob said he entered her room, the door was unlocked, and he found Sharon lying on the bed, awake but not with it. He said they had some kind of conversation in her room. Sharon was on some kind of potent medication, with 2 specific warnings to the effect that it was not to be taken with any form of alcohol or any dairy product. But Bob said there was an empty bottle of alcohol on Sharon's dresser, along with the remains of a chunk of cheese. He also said that in his conversation with her, she very plainly told him what she had taken and that she had done enough research into the effects of mixing alcohol and dairy with her medicine to be sure that the mixture and amount she had taken was more than enough to kill her. So Bob took her out to his car and drove her to the hospital. And according to Bob, Sharon was awake, lucid, and she talked with the doctors as she was being wheeled into the hospital in a wheelchair. The doctors ran tests on her and determined that they were too late to save her. This last statement by Bob to Jim is an odd one. Again, if he decided to lie about something important, that could be proven false.
quite easily. Now, the doctors did run tests on Sharon and determined that they might save her by using antidotes to the poison, and they did this with drugs and charcoal filtration. And this treatment lasted the next 12 hours. Bob knew this because he was there the whole time. So why he told a lie to his friend isn't clear. He seemed to enjoy toying with the truth and maybe wanted to see how much he could get away with. I don't know.
Yeah, he did have that kind of personality. Bob did say, "Damn, I always knew she would do something stupid." These words may have been for the benefit of the medical staff that heard them, showing that Bob was angry by her suicide. But the death of Sharon would lead to his eventual downfall. 3 dead wives and 2 dead children in less than 16 years was just too much to be coincidental. The day that Sharon overdosed set off a series of events that would finally bring justice to Bob's victims.
Now, for all his luck in evading prosecution for his crimes, Bob Spangler didn't know when to shut up. He liked the attention. He liked the sympathy that he got as a loving husband and father who had survived the tragic deaths of his wives and children. In late October 1994, he called Bernie Davy, Donna's daughter, and told her, "Tragedy has struck once again." Bob went on to say that things had been going along pretty well for Sharon in his home, and added, "Her long history of self-doubt, anxiety, and clinical depression finally overwhelmed her. She took her own life, with pills, dying in a hospital here Sunday morning, October 2nd.
Yeah, it was kind of weird he contacted her, and he also contacted one of Donna's sons and had the nerve to ask if he would like to go on another hike with him in the Grand Canyon. He said that the fall colors would be very nice. Then Bob went on to say that he planned to take a batch of wildflower seeds to the Grand Canyon in the spring and scatter them at what he called Donna's Point. Donna's Point was the place where he had pushed her off the cliff. That he could write these things without any guilt or remorse just shows how heartless he really was. But Donna's son wasn't an idiot. He began to think about the circumstances of his mother's death, the way Bob acted at the memorial service, and the news now that Sharon was dead too. He'd already been told by Bob that his first wife had killed the children and herself. All of this, along with the inconsistencies about Donna's death, really began to disturb him. One of the things that bothered him the most was the way Bob had cremated Donna's remains so quickly after her death, not even consulting her children, and that Bob did not have a celebration of her life with friends, but had held a somber memorial service that he alone was in control of. Then Bob even made things worse by what he did with Sharon's cousin Richard, who was the executor of her estate. Bob always claimed he didn't make money off his dead spouses, but that was not true, and his legal battle with Sharon's cousin proved just how far he would go to get as much money as he could. From the 1988 divorce settlement signed by both Bob and Sharon, it was agreed that he would receive $20,000 from her estate if she died before him. Sharon's cousin, who lived in Florida, had to make several trips to Colorado to take care of her estate. In this process, he ran up bills that came to $5,000. So he charged this against the $20,000 that Bob was going to receive, leaving him with $15,000. But oh no, that wasn't good enough for Bob. Bob wanted the full amount, and he actually took Sharon's cousin to court. So even though Bob had gained quite a lot by Sharon's death, no longer paying the $400 a month and not having to give her a $5,000 gift he'd promised for 1995, he still wanted every single dollar he could get. In the end, he won in court, and he did receive the full $20,000. Sharon's cousin was so infuriated by this that he never even wanted Bob Spangler's name mentioned in his presence again.
Bill Burnett, one of Donna's friends since the 1970s, was suspicious when he heard about Sharon's death. And he was suspicious enough to phone the Coconino County Sheriff's Office Criminal Investigative Division in Arizona. Bill's phone call was taken by Detective Lieutenant Rex Sturman. Burnett told him about Sharon's supposed suicide and the death of Nancy Spangler back in 1978.
Yeah, this caused enough concern that Sturman told a member of his unit, Detective Bruce Cornish, to look into it.
Yeah, on November 4th, 1994, Detective Cornish spoke with Bill Burnett on the telephone. Burnett said that Donna's death had always bothered him, and he didn't think it was an accident. And now that Sharon was dead, all of the wives and ex-wives who had died around Bob Spangler were just too suspicious. Bill knew Donna's daughter Bernie, and she had related Bob's letter to him about Sharon's suicide, and this letter had led Bill to call the authorities. Bill said that Bob had hiked nearly 1,000 miles in the Grand Canyon over the years and knew of its dangers. He also knew that Bob knew Donna had vertigo and was not a strong hiker, so he said Bob had no business taking Donna on a trail where she died.
Well, that's what I said. No way. Now, Detective Cornish called the Durango Police Department about Sharon's suicide, but they said they didn't have any records of a suicide in October of 1994. So he called the La Plata County Sheriff's Office next. They did know about Sharon Spangler's death, but they told him they hadn't investigated the matter and that he should contact the La Plata County Coroner's Office to get more information. So on November 7th, Cornish spoke with Deputy Rye about what he had seen at the area where Donna had fallen off the cliff at the Grand Canyon. Rye told him the area where Donna had been hiking was extremely rugged and there were loose rocks there. In his opinion, it would have been easy for someone to accidentally fall in that area. Rye told Cornish that Bob was an experienced hiker and should have known better than to take Donna on that trail. He did, however, say there was a particular spot where Bob indicated he had set up his camera to take a photo, just as he had written in his report. It was a good place to take a photo, with them in the foreground and the canyon in the background. Roy also said he would not have picked that spot where Donna had fallen from to murder someone. At that spot, it looked like there was only a 25 to 30-foot drop-off to the cliff, but there was a chute that could not be seen from the bottom of the cliff, and it descended at least another 100 feet. What Deputy Rye may not have known was that Bob had hiked this trail many times. He knew all about its terrain and could have known about the rocky chute that descended below the red wall. So at around the same time that Detective Cornish began his investigation, Sharon Spangler's suicide showed up on the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office radar screen. This came about because Bill Burnett decided to call them too about his suspicions. He talked to Sergeant Steve Curdy in the Investigation Division, and at 3 p.m. on November 4th, 1994, Sergeant Curdy made an important phone call. He asked investigator Paul Goodman to look into the death of Sharon Spangler. He knew there'd always been suspicions about Bob's innocence concerning the deaths of Nancy, Susan, David, and now Donna. Investigator Goodman brought up some old files and discovered that Nancy, Susan, and David had died on December 30th, 1978, Donna Spangler on April 11th, 1993, and Sharon Cooper Spangler on October 2nd, 1994. So none of this was suspicious on the surface, except that they were all young and dying so suddenly and dying from unnatural causes. What were the odds?
They're pretty high, aren't they?
I would think.
So on November 7th, 1994, Goodman contacted Detective Cornish in Arizona and filled him in on the details of the Nancy Spangler case. Detective Cornish discussed a little about Donna's death and agreed to send Goodman a copy of his report. Cornish said Donna's case had been labeled an accidental fall, but the case was being reopened by his office, and he was going to look into it. So during their conversation, Investigator Goodman told Cornish that Bob Spangler had taken 2 polygraph tests in 1979 and had controlled his breathing. So it could not be determined whether Spangler was being truthful or lying. And when asked why he had controlled his breathing on the second test, Bob had replied, "Because I received training in public speaking, and that's the way you're supposed to breathe when you're nervous."
I don't think that's true. I think when you're nervous, you're supposed to do slow, deep breaths.
Slow, deep breaths.
Not hyperventilate. Well, Investigator Goodman took on the old Spangler-Littleton case as a sort of fill-in, something to look into in his spare time. He did have other cases to work on in Arapahoe County and couldn't do it full-time. Still, he was interested, and 1 month later he contacted investigator Scott Jackson in Durango. Jackson told him that the coroner's report showed that Sharon had been suicidal before and often depressed. She had even talked to Dr. Boyd at the hospital, indicating that she had taken a lethal dose of alcohol and pills. No sheriff's investigation had taken place then, and none was ongoing. On November 21st, 1994, Detective Cornish spoke with Donna's daughter, Bernie Davy, and she told him about the letter that she had received from Bob Spangler. Bob had told her in the letter that the suicide had happened in part because of Sharon's problems with her boyfriend and her long history of mental illness. But he also twisted this story, saying he couldn't wake up Sharon after he returned from his soccer game that day. This was a complete contradiction to his other story to Jim Ullman, that Sharon had been awake when he went into her room. Bernie told Detective Cornish she wasn't sure if Bob had pushed her mother over the cliff at the Grand Canyon, but she did have many questions about it. And one of the things that bothered her was that Bob wore a hearing aid most of the time, but he told her that when he hiked in the canyon he never wore one. So Bernie wondered if he wasn't wearing a hearing aid, how could he have heard Donna gasp or take a small breath, like he said he had, before she fell over the side?
And Detective Cornish called all 4 members of the group who had hiked on the Grandview Trail and kept crossing paths with Bob and Donna Spangler on April 10th and 11th in 1993. These 4 guys are Mark Stephen, Rick Morgan, Kevin O'Leary, and Elizabeth Duncan. All of them told him things that had happened that they thought were strange. Mark Stephen told Cornish about Bob trying to keep tabs on all of them, especially where they were going to camp for the night of April 10th. Rick Morgan told Cornish if you're going to harm someone, it would be a good spot. It would be out of the way, and you'd be alone. Kevin O'Leary told him about Bob's unusual remark right after they had exchanged addresses, that he might need a new hiking partner in November. O'Leary thought this remark was way out of line, considering that Bob's wife had just died a few hours before.
You think?
Yeah,
just a little.
Maybe, huh?
Right. Detective Cornish contacted Donna's friends in the Durango and Evergreen areas. Some thought that the relationship between Bob and Donna had been fine back in 1993, but not everyone agreed with that. One of the doubters was Sandy Brooks, who had known Donna in the Evergreen area and also knew that she was afraid of hiking in the Grand Canyon. She told Detective Cornish about her remark to Donna in April of 1993, saying she didn't have to go there if she was scared. But Donna had told her that she was going because Bob was so insistent. In December 1994, Detective Cornish spoke to Donna's son, Bruce Sundling. Bruce said that he hadn't seen his mother and Bob since Christmas of 1992. He felt at that time that Bob controlled his mother and was very domineering. And she had told him that they didn't seem to have much in common anymore. Then Detective Cornish spoke with Dr. Boyd in Durango and found out that he had not only been a physician to Donna, but to Sharon Spangler as well. For Donna, he had prescribed meclizine for vertigo and Prozac for depression. So now Detective Cornish was ready to pay Bob Spangler a visit at his Durango home. It was August 8, 1995. Bob was surprised, but didn't seem very concerned when he let him into his house. They both sat down, and Bob seemed relaxed as they talked. Cornish asked him why he had taken Donna on such a dangerous trail, since he knew she wasn't such a good hiker. Bob said that the trail was wide enough to walk down, and he didn't think it was very dangerous. Cornish then asked him what medication Donna had been taking. When Bob answered he didn't know she was taking any medication at all, this was in direct contradiction to the remarks he'd made to others, and even in that newspaper interview. Bob claimed not to know that Donna needed meclizine for vertigo, or that she even had vertigo.
Yeah, an attentive husband.
Right.
So Cornish asked Bob about wearing a hearing aid. He said he did have trouble hearing soft-spoken people, but he didn't wear a hearing aid. Asked why he had camped at the illegal spot near the mine entrance on Horseshoe Mesa when he knew that was illegal, Bob said they camped there in order to get an early start the next morning.
Yeah, so Cornish already had plans to have Bob tested on a polygraph at the San Juan County Sheriff's Office in Farmington, New Mexico. He told Bob that fact and told him it would be a good way of clearing his name of any suspicions that people might be holding about Donna's death. But the reaction from Bob was like nothing Cornish had ever seen before. Almost immediately, Bob jumped off the couch and began pacing the floor. He began hyperventilating and muttering to himself, "Should I do it? Should I talk to him?" Finally, he explained to Detective Cornish that he had taken a polygraph back in 1979 because of the tragedy in Littleton, and it had been just a horrible experience. He said he had hyperventilated then because he was so nervous. Cornish tried to lessen Bob's fears about a polygraph test and told him if he did take one, he could tell Donna's kids the results and give them some peace of mind. But the mention of Donna's kids only seemed to make Bob more upset, and then he said he would never take another polygraph.
So Cornish continued his own investigation, and he had some interesting things to tell Goodman. He said that Donna Spangler's children felt that Bob had been in a rush to cremate her body. They also said that Donna had sold her house in Evergreen, Colorado, at Bob's insistence, so they could both purchase the house in Durango. When it came time to draw up the deed on the Durango property, Bob had wanted it in his name only, and he only backed down when Donna stood her ground on that one issue. So he relented, and both their names were included. But the biggest eye-opener of all was the family questioning why Bob had taken Donna to the Grand Canyon that Easter week. He knew she suffered from vertigo, and he knew she was not a strong hiker. She had even told him about her fears about the place. So it's a circumstantial case and a combination of everything that made Bob look suspicious. Investigator Goodman's caseload was heavy for the next 5 months, and he only returned to the Spangler investigation after a long delay. But when he did, it was significant. He called Bob Spangler in Durango on April 14, 1995, and asked if Bob still owned the gun that had been used in a murder-suicide back in Littleton. Bob told Goodman that he had sold it after picking it up at the Arapahoe County Sheriff's Office. Investigator Goodman asked him if he had copies of the autopsy reports on the deaths of Nancy, Susan, and David. Bob said, "No, I don't."
Yeah, so for the rest of 1995, Investigator Goodman tried getting information about Bob Spangler's finances through insurance companies and other companies to see if Bob had benefited from the deaths of his wives. But because of the way the state financial laws were structured, he couldn't get any of the information he wanted. In early 1996, Goodman started working with Arapahoe County's new coroner, Dr. Michael Doberson. It was a very frustrating time since Goodman couldn't find any of the original autopsy reports, and all of the other physical evidence from Nancy, Susan, and David's case seemed to be missing as well. All the tissue samples that were normally held were never found. Whether they had been destroyed or lost in the intervening years, no one knew. But luckily for Goodman, Dr. Doberson was a good ally and did become interested in the Spangler case. Dr. Doberson was able to find copies of the original coroner's investigative and toxicological reports on the victims. In June 1996, Goodman provided Dr. Doberson with some crime scene photos taken at the time of the deaths of Nancy, Susan, and David Spangler. He asked Dr. Doberson to take a look at the photos and try to determine if all the deaths could have been homicides. If Dr. Doberson indicated that Nancy had indeed committed suicide, Goodman would drop the case and move on to something else. In summation of his report, Dr. Doberson wrote, "The most unusual feature of this case is the presence of an intermediate range. As noted above, self-inflicted gunshot wounds are typically of a contact nature. While the presence of an intermediate range gunshot wound does not rule out the possibility of suicide, it does allow one to entertain other possibilities, homicide." So when viewed within the context of other circumstances, for example, a neuromuscular condition from which Nancy Spangler suffered, which resulted in weakness and unsteadiness, more questions regarding the manner of death arise. In any event, the findings warrant further investigation. So Dr. Doberson gave Investigator Goodman a green light to keep investigating Bob Spangler as the possible killer of his entire family in Littleton back in 1978. Goodman got an anatomically correct model of a human skull in August of 96, and using autopsy photos that Dr. Doberson supplied, Goodman and senior lab technician Dick Hopkins determined the probable wound path for Nancy Spangler's fatal gunshot wound. A 1/8 diameter rod was placed through the skull to depict this path. A toy gun similar to the actual .38 revolver was installed on the rod to show placement, distance, and angularity of the weapon. To back up his claims, Dr. Doberson provided Investigator Goodman with a copy of Sites of Suicidal Gunshot Wounds, a study conducted by King County, Washington Medical Examiners Division. The study concluded that only 25% of women studied used firearms to kill themselves. Women generally committed suicide by slashing their wrists or taking an overdose. And of the few women who did kill themselves with guns, they usually did not shoot themselves in the head. They usually aimed for the heart. Most of them did not want to disfigure their faces in death.
And then to further support the irregularity of Nancy's wounds, almost no women held the gun at length to shoot themselves. Those who did use guns generally pressed them against their bodies. So Nancy holding the gun at some distance became even more improbable when it was recalled she had weakness in her right hand and could not hold a heavy object, such as a gun, steadily. So in November 1996, Investigator Goodman met with Arapahoe County lab techs, and after reviewing photographs, they stated that they found the deaths of Nancy, Susan, and David Spangler to be suspicious. In April 1997, Goodman interviewed a law enforcement officer who had actually been at the scene of the Spangler home in December of 1978, and this was Karen Beauchamp, who's now a detective. She told Goodman that Sergeant Marv Tucker and Lieutenant Les Murray were on the scene when she arrived. Her main job at the time had been searching the premises for any new clues. She recalled that document examiner Andrew Bradley had compared known typewritten samples from the typewriter recovered at the scene with a suicide note, and Bradley had made a positive match between this note and the typewriter. He also compared known examples of Nancy Spangler's handwriting with the end signed on the suicide note. In Bradley's opinion, all were written by the same person.
At this point, Goodman asked a question no one had asked before. Was it Bob Spangler who gave Bradley the examples? I don't know, Beauchamp replied, but she went on to say that even though Bob tested positive for gunshot residue and Nancy didn't, that was explainable. Colorado Bureau of Investigation experts had advised her that Bob could have handled the gun, as he said he did, and obtained levels of gunshot residue that would be traceable. So there was no conclusion ever made whether Bob had fired the gun or not. The suicide note had looked so authentic that it just kind of sealed the deal and there was no further investigation. But Beauchamp did tell Goodman Jack Swanberg, the lab technician who ran the gunshot residue test, was a friend of Bob Spangler's. This was the first time Goodman had heard about that. Beauchamp ended her interview by saying she always wanted to interview Bob Spangler about tire tracks in the snow of his driveway that were noticed on December 30th, 1978. He'd mentioned the trips he had taken with the car out of the driveway that morning, but the tire tracks indicated more trips than Bob had mentioned. Beauchamp said she never got a chance to interview Bob Spangler again after the final Colorado Bureau of Investigation report came in back in 1979. Beauchamp said she still had doubts about Bob's innocence, but her supervisor had ordered her to clear the case, and the official conclusion was that Nancy Spangler had killed her children and herself. Finally, in January of 1999, investigators from the different jurisdictions linked the cold case homicides together. The National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime recommended that investigators complete a subject history on Bob Spangler. They suggested using the NCAVC Behavioral Assessment Questionnaire when interviewing some of Spangler's associates. Further investigation concluded that Bob Spangler was an educated, intelligent, and successful man. As a charismatic person, he worked in human relations and public speaking. Spangler spent a significant amount of time living in different parts of Colorado and hiking the Grand Canyon. One lead followed up by the FBI resulted in an interview with a woman living in a small Colorado community who contacted authorities a few weeks after her first interview. At that time, she gave them a copy of a letter that she received from Spangler, in which he told her he had terminal cancer. So the investigative team immediately approached Bob Spangler. They felt like a confession would be critical for prosecutors because of the lack of physical evidence. So the investigative team went out to Colorado to interview Bob. In Colorado, local law enforcement and the local FBI office supported investigators. Because any prosecution would depend on the admissibility of his confession, the investigative team videotaped the interview. Bob's terminal cancer created some issues regarding mental competence and the voluntariness of his statements. To avoid questions about this down the line, they used what they called a telephonic interview strategy. A medical doctor retained by their unit analyzed Bob Spangler's medical records, confirmed his condition, and gave advice regarding any competency issues that could come up.
So investigators approached Bob at home with the assistant district attorney, and he agreed to an interview at the local sheriff's office. The FBI agent and the Arapahoe County detective initiated the actual interview with the assistant DA monitoring it from another room. The first day of interviewing lasted about 4 hours. Bob believed investigators when they told him that FBI profilers wanted to study him because he was a unique killer. Like some other serial murderers, his compulsion to kill fascinated him, and he found himself to be special. Investigators did confront Bob with the 1978 murders of his wife and children, the drug overdose of his second wife, Sharon, and the murder of his third wife, Donna, in the Grand Canyon. And at the end of the interview, Bob told investigators, "Well, you naming one too many. Remember." He left, agreeing to contact investigators in the morning if he wanted to continue the interview. Contrary to expectations of the investigation team, Bob did call the FBI agent the next day and made an appointment to continue the interview.
Yeah, they were pretty surprised by that, really.
I'll bet.
They thought they'd never
see him again.
Exactly. During the second interview, though, Bob told investigators how, while married to his first wife, he fell in love with another woman, then shot his wife and 2 teenage children so he could be with the other woman. Bob said he smothered his son with a pillow after shooting him because the gunshot wound did not kill him. But Bob denied involvement in the overdose death of his second wife, and he refused to discuss the death in the Grand Canyon because he wanted to avoid a civil lawsuit from Donna's grown children. So he's always thinking about that bottom dollar.
Oh, yeah.
But the investigators really encouraged Bob to talk about the Grand Canyon murder by telling him that killing several people at one time did not make him a serial killer. He would only be a serial killer if he'd killed Donna. So amazingly, this approach worked on Bob, and he eventually said, "You've got your serial." Bob then proceeded to explain in detail how he had masterminded the Grand Canyon murder and pushed his third wife over the edge while she was looking right at him. The investigative team accurately predicted several of Bob Spangler's behaviors and responses. They understood that he was concerned about his public image. After confessing, Bob sent the FBI a letter pleading to minimize the publicity about the case. In this letter, Bob argued that he was not like other serial killers who target people for race or sexual orientation, correctly assessing that some serial killers target groups who they perceive to be undesirable. But Bob's motivation to kill centered around gains for himself when he eliminated his wives and his children. During the interview, he told investigators that killing them was easier than filing for divorce.
Yeah. So the results of this investigation included Bob Spangler's confession to 4 homicides, 3 of them from 22 years ago. He pleaded guilty in federal district court in Arizona to the first-degree murder of his third wife, and he admitted killing his first wife and 2 children. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He died of cancer while in federal prison.
Yeah, so what a guy, huh?
I'll tell you.
Quite a story. And then don't forget his father, too, which I really think sounds like he did that, too.
The timing's pretty suspicious, isn't it?
Absolutely it is, yeah. So that wraps that up, but a couple of reminders. Remember, we have a premium option of TCB where you can get early ad-free and bonus shows. You also get a gift and some swag with a thank you note. We do a bonus show at least once a month, usually twice. And if that interests you, we would really appreciate your support. You can do that by going to tiegrabber.com/subscribe, or you can get the same benefits at our Patreon site, patreon.com/tiegrabber. Other ways we ask you to support the show is to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to us, or send us an email or a voicemail with your feedback and case suggestions. We would love that. If you have feedback or case suggestions for us to cover on an upcoming show, you can send an email to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, and voicemails can be sent by clicking on the voicemail link in our show notes or on our website. We do feedback almost every episode. Today we're not because it's the holidays and this is a long episode. But we'd like to thank you for spending your time with us at the Quiet End and wish you a Happy New Year.
That's right. It's a new year.
Yep. So when the new year comes, we'll see you at the Quiet End.
We'll be waiting for you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.